There are two kinds of people: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, "All right then, have it your way." Experience, that most brutal of teachers, but you learn. My God, do you learn. Those are two quotes by C.S. Lewis. God created us in his own image and blessed us in Genesis 1:26 through 28. In the Garden of Eden, we were connected to him and able to fellowship with him. But then came the fall, and as a result of that, not only would man eventually face physical death, but we experienced a spiritual death in that we became separated from a holy God by our sin. So Adam and Eve had to leave the Garden of Eden and go make a way for themselves in the world, Genesis 3:23 through 24. The perfect relationship that Adam had known with God was now lost, and a life of dependence on God in the middle of trials began. God had supplied all their needs for them in the garden. Now they had to go forth and work for them by growing their food and building shelter. Their disobedience didn't make them any less dependent on God. If anything, they were more dependent because achieving these things would be difficult. They were no longer in the shelter of the perfect place that God had created for man. We were no longer in his perfect will, but outside of it, for Adam and Eve had sinned. So the world that they ventured into was not Eden, but a fallen world due to their sin, so life would not be easy anymore. Adam and Eve ventured on and went about making a life for themselves, and they began a family in Genesis 4:1 through 2. But again, it wasn't a family born into Eden, but into a fallen world, so it wouldn't be long before they experienced the type of trials they would face in their new environment. Adam and Eve disobeying God introduced sin into the world, which separated us from God. Mankind was filled with all types of feelings like anger and jealousy. On our own, we cannot control our fleshly desire to sin. It is only through God and his grace that we can conquer this. Who is it that we believe? Do we fall for the line that the devil gave where he said that we can become like God? Or do we surrender and allow God to be God, the Alpha and the Omega? So enter the first siblings, Cain and Abel. We had one believing and one not. One thinking he was in charge of his destiny, and the other saying, "No, you give it all to God and then accept what he gives you back." They both brought offerings to God. The Bible tells us that the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering in Genesis 4:4. But with Cain, God had no respect for him or his offering, and this upset Cain, Genesis 4:5. God didn't have this reaction to Cain because his offering wasn't big enough or because he didn't have it on a gold-encrusted plate. God looked at Cain's heart and knew he wasn't sincere and obedient in his faith. God saw a selfishness in Cain and a will that didn't want to do right, Genesis 4:6 through 7. In Genesis 4:6 through 7, God says to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it." So God was saying to him, if you are faithful and obedient, you are inside the will of God and are accepted. He then tells Cain that sin is at his door when he is not doing right, and he must resist or master it. James 4:7 through 8 tells us, "Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded." In the next verse, we see that Cain did not submit himself to God or resist sin, but moved further into it by killing his brother Abel in Genesis 4:8. When God questioned Cain as to Abel's whereabouts, instead of confessing, repenting, and asking for forgiveness, Cain answered, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" in Genesis 4:9. Wow. First, Cain lies to God. He knew what happened to Abel. Then he smart-mouths God. This emphasizes that Cain had already made the decision that he did not need God. God knew what Cain had done to Abel. He was trying to give Cain an opportunity to repent and ask for forgiveness. Cain, on the other hand, didn't feel the need to do that. Cain decided that he didn't need God. He chose to believe the lie that he could be like God and live his life outside of God's will. It goes back to the first quote by C.S. Lewis. There are two kinds of people, those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, "All right then, have it your way." God had reached that point with Cain. God told Cain, "You are under a curse. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you." Genesis 4:11 through 12. Think about your job for a moment. If you did something wrong and then spoke to your boss the way Cain did to God, don't you think it would affect your career? Of course it would. Now think about working and not having God's blessing upon your work. Talk about frustrating. You would constantly bump your head trying to do things in your own power, which is something that we've all experienced when we think we're in control. And when you did achieve something, it was fleeting and didn't last long because it was of the flesh. We've all had to learn this lesson at some point, but many of us realize we're outside of God's will. We can't do it without Him, without His blessing, and reach back for the covering of the Lord. Cain, however, took it to the other direction. Genesis 4:16 tells us, "So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden." Cain chose to go his own way, away from God. He chose not to believe he needed God. He believed the lie. So Cain and his descendants were the start of mankind living apart from God. So many in the world live this type of existence today. They make their own rules, they set their own standards, and establish their own values without any thought of God and His Word. They try to prove there is no need for God, pursue pleasure, and try to save themselves without God's help. They try to recreate Eden without the Creator. And as they push along, even in their successes, they experience misery. Look at the divorce rate, the abortion rate, the murder rate, alcoholism, drug use, sexual perversion. About as far away from paradise as you can get. But even in the midst of this, you will still have those that know the only way to paradise is with God. You see, Cain killed Abel and then went about living his life on his own accord, but that wasn't the end of it. Genesis 4:25 tells us that Eve had another son named Seth. Seth eventually had a son named Enos in Genesis 4:26, and then the Bible tells us, "Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord." Enos encouraged public prayer and worship, while Cain and his family focused on worldly things and business, trying to establish a self-reliant lifestyle. The family of Seth called upon the Lord, showing their dependence on Him. So with these two families began two different types of groups on the earth, the godly and the ungodly. The godly people knew they were not in Eden anymore, and that because we had sinned and separated ourselves from God, we would need Him more than ever. They knew the only way to make it through this life was to call upon the Lord. They knew that we needed His blessings, His covering, and to lean upon Him. Adam, Eve, and Cain proved that human beings were capable of making bad decisions. They proved that the flesh was weak. They proved that God does not force Himself upon you, but allows you to make the choice to follow Him. Seth's family knew they needed God, and unlike Cain, wanted His presence. They knew during those difficult times that God's grace was sufficient and His power is made perfect in our weakness. 2 Corinthians 12:9. As these two families lived upon the earth, the important thing to remember is that God did not abandon those who chose not to believe. They walked away from Him. And as the godly called upon the Lord, He knew that sin still separated us from Him, a holy God. The thing about the Lord is that He sits high and sees low. He knew that we, the creation, needed to be reconciled back to our Creator. And as God put this into motion, he didn't think about just the godly people, but also those who rejected him, once again allowing all of mankind the opportunity to enter back into his holy presence. So it boils down to this: we are still dependent on God. And who do you believe? Did you fall for the line that the devil ran when he said that you are like God now? Or do you surrender and allow the one and only God to be in charge, the Alpha and the Omega? As time progressed, God showed us one believing and one not believing, as in Abel and Cain. One thinking he could change his destiny, and the other saying, no, you give it all to God, and then accept what he gives you back. Are you going to believe Satan and his lie like Cain, who would kill his brother for worshiping God truly and try to make his worship more appealing by having Abel's absent? Cain believed that he could be like God, and that is where we are being asked today. Are you trying to be like God, believing you make your own destiny and decisions? Or are you willing to lay down your life and follow God? That is why we are told to be like sheep, because they do not want to lead the shepherd, they follow him, knowing that he will lead them away from harm to all that is good. And that is what we are asked to do: surrender our life to God and follow him. Those who do that are having a true relationship with God. Those who don't are not. The choice is yours.